Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Now here's your host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is Kristine Ashcraft, president and founder at YouScript. Kristine, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
So, Kristine, what I always like to do before getting into the main part of the conversation is give my guests a chance to provide more of an introduction in terms of who they are and what they do. So, Kristine, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, in a nutshell, I have been catalyzing the adoption of precision prescribing for almost 25 years to help end the adverse drug event epidemic currently claiming an American life every 2 minutes. I am currently, as you said, the founder and president of YouScript. That's a clinical decision support tool that synthesizes all information impacting drug response, including genetics, to enable safer and more effective prescribing at the point of care. YouScript is part of the Arancia family of companies that also includes To Be Precise, a precision medicine platform, and Access DX, a high-quality laboratory that offers pharmacogenetic testing, which I'll talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, no, before we get into those topics, I always also like to know what got you into healthcare in the first place?
It's a great question. So when I was in high school, I unfortunately watched my grandmother die of cancer. And I still get a little choked up every time I say that sentence. But I studied molecular biology in college because I wanted to find a cure to cancer. And learned pretty quickly that although I find genetics absolutely fascinating, research behind the bench, although incredibly important, was not for me. I needed a role that was more people focused. And so in 2000, I was lucky enough to get a job at one of the first genetics labs in the country that was actually founded in 1987 as one of the first crime labs in the country. They actually invented some of the first probes used for human DNA identification. And when I joined, they were looking for something that leveraged their core competency in providing really high quality genetic testing. And we became one of the first CLIA accredited labs to offer pharmacogenetic testing in the country back in 2000. And I, at the time, was in charge of sales and marketing, and I think had a pretty unique opportunity to talk to literally thousands of patients, providers, about widespread barriers to adoption of pharmacogenetic testing. Even at that time, there were literally thousands of publications on just how important this information is in care and how it can help us optimize drug and dose selection. And I would get the same questions over and over again. Well, how do I know who to test? How do I know how to act on that in the context of other things that impact drug response? It's not just the genes. Well, how do we know this actually works? Where are the studies validating that this will reduce healthcare costs? Where are the studies validating that this will impact clinical decision-making, reduce healthcare spend? And so the last number of years really focusing on that work. So have published pretty extensively studies that show pharmacogenetic testing in combination with YouScript to reduce emergency room visits, hospitalizations, readmissions, healthcare costs, and helped put this clinical decision support tool in Epic, Cerner, other EHRs for over a decade to drive better outcomes.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to unpack there because it's, even though it sounds like you're describing, kind of testing and other sources of information and knowledge that have been around for a period of time, it might be a piece that people aren't necessarily as familiar with within the healthcare field. So, you were just talking about kind of pharmacogenetic testing, and then before that mentioned precision prescribing.
Yeah.
Could you help unpack what those mean?
Sure. So typically we have provided prescriptions to patients in a one-size-fits-all manner. Like, you're an adult, you get the adult dose, take it, we'll see if it works. If it doesn't, we can switch your drug or your dose. And we assume that patients will respond in a similar manner, even though everybody in healthcare knows that's not the case. Some people get no response, or they need a higher dose or a lower dose. or have very bad adverse effects, even at standard doses of medications. And a lot of the medications that we take hit these enzymes in our liver. Just to simplify it, think of them like highways. So you've got like I-5, 99, and we assume everybody has 2 lanes genetically of these different highways that process medications. And genetically, some people have 1 lane, no lanes, or 3 or more lanes of these different highways. And drugs are very specific as to what lanes they want to drive on. And our genetics, determines that. So if for example, if I-5, I'm in Seattle, if that's one of the main thoroughfares through your city and it's shut down, that's very good information. You're going to take a different highway to get where you need to go. And so pharmacogenetic testing mainly looks at our ability to create these highways that process medications. So we can pick medications that go on a different highway or give more or less of the medication based on that kind of availability. And then the drugs that we take, herbals, foods even, like grapefruit juice. A lot of people have had an antibiotic and they're like, don't take this with grapefruit juice. They add traffic to the system. So YouScript, the clinical decision support tool, I think it's really very similar to that real-time traffic app on your phone, right? But instead of warning of traffic jams caused by cars and road construction and accidents, we warn of metabolic traffic jams, whether the cause is those genes, drugs, herbals, foods. And just like that app says, hey, I-5 is shut down, here's what you can do to get from point A to point B. Instead, we go, hey, here's a heart blood pressure medication that can bypass this issue and be more useful for your patient.
So what goes into that testing to be able to start gathering that insight on the individual patient?
So right now, there are typically comprehensive pharmacogenetic panels run by CLIA labs. And they look at the genes that have high evidence drug gene interactions associated with them. So there's an NIH-funded guidelines body called CPIC, the Clinical Pharmacogenetics Implementation Consortium. And they publish guidelines with the assumption that testing has been done that say, oh, if you're a poor metabolizer, you shouldn't take this drug at all. Or if you're a poor metabolizer, you need half the dose. So they have these evidence-based guidelines. And then also the FDA has guidance in a growing number of product labels that say, avoid this drug or modify the dose in such a way based on these genetics. So laboratories generally run a panel that includes as many of these high evidence drug gene interactions as possible. And some also include developing evidence genes so that you don't have to retest in the future if we think there will be evidence-based guidance in the not so distant future.
And then typically which type of clinician or who's taking the charge in terms of ordering the testing? Because, it seems like a lot of different people involved in one individual's care might be interested, but might not be sure who's actually going to take the lead to figure out, how to determine the best drug or other pharmaceutical to take.
It's a great question. So those, drug highways, so to speak, that we test for are the same highways for drugs across all sorts of different specialties. So mental health, pain management, cancer care, GI. And generally, the testing is ordered by a provider who's actually had education that this information is really important for safety and effectiveness for those medications they're providing. Medicare will cover a panel test if at least one drug already prescribed or under consideration is impacted by these high evidence drug gene interactions, according to the FDA or CPIC. So ideally, whether it's the primary care provider, the cardiologist, the oncologist, whoever orders it, a comprehensive panel is done. And the patient is taught to take that information to all of their other healthcare providers. We're also seeing a lot more health systems deploy population level programs. So for example, we integrated YouScript into Epic at Christ Hospital Health System in Ohio. And they have, I believe, 11 ambulatory care pharmacists that rotate through over 30 primary care clinics, as well as cardiology, oncology, surgical management. And they have population level tools that we integrate in that say, hey, Matt should get tested. There's an 85% probability if we test him, we'll be recommending a drug or dose change to one of his doctors when those results come back. So they actively manage that, very similar to, a diabetes care management program, for example, only it's a medication risk reduction program that's more run at a population level at a health system.
So kind of with that one particular program, maybe as an example, where you said you've got kind of this cohort of people moving around to the different sites, that also seems to go back to a point that you made around, needing the education and training on the testing. So what is that kind of education and training look like? And that seems to also imply that not every clinician out there is equipped at the moment to understand, I guess, when to do the testing or how to interpret the results that come back.
It's a great question, and why I'm such a huge fan of integrated clinical decision support like YouScript, because it flags for appropriate testing. I think a lot of times people think of genetics and they're like, oh, scary, and they kind of quit listening. But really, if people understand basic drug-drug interactions, they understand drug-gene interactions. A lot of times when they warn us not to take drugs together, it's because one of the drugs inhibits these highways I talked about in the liver, or induces. It tells the body to open extra lanes. And really what our genetics does is something very similar, only it doesn't go away. You have lanes closed or you have extra lanes genetically all the time. And so people are already trained to understand the impact of this. In their practice, they just don't naturally know, which drugs it applies to. There is a great movement happening right now that I have helped support for a few years. Swalwell and Crenshaw introduced the Right Drug Dose Now Act of 2024. And this is a legislation that would help us address the adverse drug event epidemic by updating the plan to address this, as well as investing in healthcare provider education so they would understand the impact that pharmacogenetic testing can have in reducing patient harm based on medications that aren't optimized or personalized to their care. It would also require that we gave as much attention to drug-gene interactions, flagging for appropriate testing, and optimizing drug or dose selection based on them, as we do for drug-drug or drug allergy. So like the FDA and drug development guidance for decades has said drug-gene and drug-drug are similar in scope and should be given similar attention. It's just not happening. So I think that legislative push, which you can learn more about at fourthcause.org/Right Act, is going to help with the education piece. But unfortunately, it's not there as much as it needs to be right now.
So I guess from that training perspective or that education perspective, is it built into medical education or other early training that physicians and other types of clinicians are receiving?
Yeah, so pharmacists have had a requirement to include pharmacogenetics in pharmacy programs for a number of years. And really, I think they're the ideal healthcare providers to incorporate this into care, as they did at Christ Hospital Health Network. I've always said, if one of my parents had a heart attack, I'd want him to see a cardiologist. If they have to take medications, I want them to see a pharmacist. Pharmacists go to school as long as MDs do to study medications and how they work in the body. So they're really the ideal provider to incorporate that into care, and they are educated on it. Within other areas, it's not a requirement. There are certifications that people can do. There are certainly CMEs. There's a website, NHGRS, has some information on genetic testing, including pharmacogenetic testing education that providers can go to. But unfortunately, it's not as widespread as it needs to be in education at this time.
Yeah, no, it sounds like as you said, there are opportunities to expand that educational piece. And for those of you just joining, I'm talking with Kristine Ashcraft from YouScript, talking a lot about pharmacogenetic testing and the gaining a better appreciation and understanding of drug-gene interactions. And Kristine, kind of one of the last points you were talking about were, adverse drug events and, the need to be able to, limit those from occurring and be more proactive in preventing. So Maybe before kind of diving into that more, can you just define what an adverse drug event constitutes?
Sure. So adverse drug events are medication-related, harm that occurs often, at the FDA-approved, like following guidance on how to give this to an adult, so to speak, or a child. And so sometimes that's treatment failures. Sometimes it's adverse effects, really bad side effects of the medication. And I think a lot of times we've kind of filed a lot of that to non-adherence. It's the patient's fault, when in fact it often is not the patient's fault. It's because they're given a medication that doesn't work for them, or a medication that they're unintentionally overdosed on. One very, I think, poignant example is 5-FU or capecitabine. These are medications that are commonly given to patients, especially after colorectal cancer, to make sure that there's no residual cells in their body after surgery. And these are very, backbone chemo drugs that are commonly used. And back to that highway analogy, about 7% of us only have one lane of this liver highway that processes these medications. So at a standard dose, they're unintentionally giving us twice as much as our body can handle. And that means patients that get that higher dose, about 25 times more likely to suffer treatment-related death. After surviving their surgery, they then get this chemo to help protect them and ensure long-term survival. And this has the opposite effect if you don't do a simple genetic test to make sure you're giving them, the appropriate dose. That's an adverse drug event. There are also less severe ones, clearly.
So then it seems like it kind of flows from what we were talking about earlier, that if you've done the appropriate testing and can understand, with your analogy, each individual's particular highway system, that allows you to identify a more appropriate dose. Or even, I think some of the other examples you were giving were choose a different drug, because oftentimes you have different choices to be able to choose from. And I think that then also goes into getting that information into the hands of the people making the decision. So is that kind of like a very accurate but overly simplified view of kind of the process?
Yeah, 100%. So if I'm a busy clinician and I am treating a patient and it says, hey, you really ought to order this test for Matt because you're about to prescribe this medication, or you just diagnosed, this patient over here with colorectal cancer, you're very likely to give him 5-FU or capecitabine later. Let's order this proactive panel, store it discreetly in the EHR, and then for every medication after that, if you go to prescribe it, we can flash up a little warning that says, hey, don't give that to that patient. It's not a good match for their genetics or the other drugs they're taking, or a combination thereof. It's causing a metabolic traffic jam. Here's a drug that does the same thing that's going to bypass that problem. But hitting the easy button to tell providers when they need to order and when, how to incorporate that in the care is really what is needed. We can provide education on the front end on how important this is, and we need to. But at the end of the day, and not just for pharmacogenetics, but I think genetics in general, we need to make it very easy to know who to test, what to order, how to act on it.
Given the benefit that can arise from it, in your reference to the legislation that's currently pending, does that imply that there is not necessarily a strict requirement or oversight when the testing needs to occur? Or have there been incidents where liability has been found because the testing didn't occur?
There are a growing number of cases, especially around the example I just gave for 5-FU and capecitabine. Unfortunately, a number of people have lost their loved ones, and the provider didn't even tell them a test was available, and that this could have been prevented. A big one happened a few years ago, 2019. Widower sued OHSU and won. Not only did she win a lawsuit, but she also won a promise that they would discuss this testing with future patients that came into their care. And there are at least several other suits pending. A lot of times these suits do get, put under NDA and settled outside of things that actually hit the news. The other thing that happened several years ago, there's a medication called Plavix or clopidogrel. This is commonly given to patients that have had a heart attack or stroke to keep them from having another heart attack or stroke. And variations are less common in patients of European ancestry, but patients of Asian ancestry and Pacific Islander ancestry have variations that shut down one or two lanes of the highway that makes this drug work. And so the population of patients in Hawaii that had Asian or Pacific Islander ancestry that would fail Plavix or clopidogrel therapy was very, very high. And they actually filed and won an $834 million lawsuit against the makers of Plavix for not making it more clear that this could happen. That drug has had a black box warning on it since 2010. That's the biggest warning the FDA can put on a medication. Yet there are probably still a lot of people taking clopidogrel or Plavix today that have never had a pharmacogenetic test. A lot of times you talk to, providers are like, oh, well, that means it's not standard of care. I don't need to worry about it. But most genetic malpractice cases in the United States are based on failure to perform genetic testing. There's a growing number of them. And then also failure to act properly on the results. And I think this, again, really highlights the need for clinical decision support to flag on who to test and how to act on that, both now and in the future.
That's a really good point, because it's, as you said, if you're seeing, people incur liability for either not testing or not appropriately acting upon it, the hope there is that will drive different behavior, so you're not in the same boat as the unfortunate group who had the adverse outcome. But I guess along with that is it sounds like the government might be getting more interested if legislation is being proposed, but are agencies, to your awareness, doing anything on that front as well in advance of any legislation?
There's a lot of work on a lot of different fronts. Another piece in adoption of any type of testing that helps improve care, including pharmacogenetics, is reimbursement. So in 2020, Medicare issued local coverage determinations that aligned pharmacogenetic testing coverage with the FDA and CPIC, the guidelines body for pharmacogenetics. And the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network has been working on biomarker legislation that has now been passed in 20 states. This requires that Medicaid and commercial insurers in the state align with evidence-based guidance to cover testing, including LCDs, guidelines like CPIC or NCCN, because unfortunately, there's often a lag between best practice and saying we should do something and insurance following suit. So that is something else that's happening, pushing across the United States. I guess that's legislative as well. So I don't think I answered your question properly.
Well, no, I think it still goes in that direction of, increased government action, because I think, as you said, if Medicare is increasing reimbursement coverage, yet another reason to pay attention to their annual fee schedules beyond all the obvious ones. But that's kind of, I think, as you're saying, a softer way that behavior can be changed, because unfortunately, I think, as we know, if a service is reimbursable, it's more likely to be provided, because then there are the resources behind it.
Right. And to your point about Medicare, I think about this. Medicare is already paying for this panel. They'll pay for it once in a patient's life. And again, you do a one-time panel. It impacts how you respond to pain medications, cancer medications, mental health medications, GI medications. A large study that was done in the UK of over 500,000 patients showed that 1 in 11 prescriptions had an evidence-based drug or dose change guidance associated with it for patients that had this information on file. So we should really be investing in this integration into the EHR and e-prescribing workflow, as the Right Drug Dose Now Active 2024 is calling for, because otherwise you do a test, it goes and lands in the ordering doctor's EHR as a PDF, and it's lost. And then a patient goes to a different doctor and the information isn't incorporated into their care. A good example, a lot of patients get this testing to optimize mental health medication selection because there's a lot of trial and error involved. And so if you can narrow the choices down to something that's more likely to work, you're going to have faster time to remission, lower pharmacy costs, lower psychiatric hospital stays. There's publications in all these areas. But that information then, say 2 years later, that patient has a heart attack. That same gene could impact the ability of the medication they're given to keep them from having another heart attack or stroke, but we need to keep it alive. So I think right now our government is investing in a seatbelt, but they're not telling people to keep wearing it. And so that's where the clinical decision support focus comes on, keeping that information alive in the clinical workflow.
Yeah, and that goes to your point about the integration. So if you're thinking about integration, what's the nature of integration that makes it actually useful? And does that then also lead into interoperability issues where, to your point, you need that information following the patient and not just sitting with the clinician who originally ordered the test?
It does, but and I'm actually leading a clinical decision support consensus development workshop in the end of this month in Washington, D.C. to help align standards so that all labs are putting the results in the same place so it's easier to follow the patient. But there are discrete places in lab results to land this information. And theoretically, that should follow the patient because lab results are part of those continuity of care documents that are supposed to easily follow us from EHR to EHR. And so the underlying infrastructure that would make that work does exist. It's just a matter of making sure that it's as seamless as we would all like it to be, not just in pharmacogenetics, but everywhere.
Yeah, which is, I think as everyone knows, one of those bigger challenges across all of healthcare. But Kristine, believe it or not, we're already almost out of time. So I want to conclude with one final question, which is, kind of one of those magic wand type questions. But what would you like to do to continue raising awareness around the benefits of this type of testing and incorporation into care?
I think, if I could wave a magic wand, the Right Drug Dose Now Act of 2024 would get passed. There's more information on it at fourthcause.org/RightAct. But I think that there are known barriers to this being incorporated into care. We know that it can reduce harm by at least 30%, probably 50% or more. Last time it was measured, 2016, we were spending $528 billion on non-optimized medications. That's more than we spend on the drugs themselves or any major chronic disease. It's the fourth leading cause of death. So we do need to take action. And I think that if we can do this legislatively, it will put the impetus behind it to make it a priority. And right now, unfortunately, it's in nice to have and rather than in must have land. It needs to be in must have land.
No, I think that's a great call to action. And as I said, believe it or not, we are already out of time. I want to thank my guest, Kristine Ashcraft, for a great conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. I appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.